Every empire in history has had a gate, not a metaphorical one. A real, physical passage through which the arteries of power flowed. Grain came through it. Soldiers marched through it. Silver and silk and oil moved through it. And whoever held that gate, whoever could open it, close it, or tax the passage, held a kind of power that no army, no navy, and no diplomatic cable could easily override. The Strait of Hormuz is that gate for the modern world. 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, flanked on one side by Iran and on the other by a thin strip of Omani coastline. Through it, every single day, flows approximately 20% of all the oil consumed on Earth. 20 million barrels, give or take, threading through a corridor barely wide enough, in maritime terms, for ships to pass in opposite directions without incident. For decades, the world accepted this arrangement with the numb complacency of someone who has always had running water and cannot quite imagine life without it. The oil flowed, the tankers passed, the markets priced in a modest geopolitical risk premium and moved on. In February of 2026, that arrangement ended, and the world discovered, with a jolt it will not soon forget, that it had built its entire civilization around a gate it did not control, and had never truly secured. This is the story of what happened when that gate closed. It is a story about geography and power, about who holds leverage and who loses it, and about why the lessons of ancient China, classical Greece, and the oil shocks of 1973 were always pointing toward this moment, even when no one was paying attention. February 28, 2026, the opening move. It begins before dawn. American and Israeli aircraft cross into Iranian airspace in a coordinated strike that, for all the years it had been whispered about in intelligence briefings and war game scenarios, still manages to shock the world when it finally arrives. By the time the sun rises over Tehran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is dead. The Islamic Republic's supreme authority, the man who had held it for over 3 decades, is gone. In Washington and Tel Aviv, there's a careful, muted satisfaction of a strategic objective achieved. Iran's nuclear program has been set back years. Its command structure is in disarray. The prevailing assumption in the hours after the strike is that Iran will retaliate, but carefully, asymmetrically, as it always has. A drone here, a proxy missile there. The familiar, manageable theater of Middle Eastern escalation. That assumption is wrong. March 1st to 3rd, 2026, Iran's answer. Within 72 hours of the strikes, something unexpected happens. Iran does not fire a retaliatory missile at an Israeli city. It does not activate Hezbollah for a full-scale assault on the northern border. Instead, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps vessels move quietly into the Strait of Hormuz and begin to mine it. It is a move of breathtaking strategic elegance. The United States has the most powerful navy on Earth. Israel has the most sophisticated air force in the Middle East. Neither of those facts matters in the slightest if your opponent has decided that the battlefield is not the sky or the sea. It is the global economy. Alongside the mines, Iran deploys drone boats, remote-controlled, explosive-laden, to stalk merchant shipping in the strait. Missile batteries on the Iranian coastline swing their muzzles seaward. And then comes the announcement that makes energy ministers around the world reach for their phones. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer safe for commercial transit. The United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, is the most powerful naval force in the region by any conventional measure. It has carrier strike groups, destroyers, minesweeping vessels, and air cover. But clearing a mine straight under active threat, with drone boats in the water and missiles on the shore, is not a quick operation. It is measured in weeks, not days. And every day the strait remains closed, the world's economy bleeds. Iran has found the one move that its adversaries, for all their military superiority, cannot quickly counter. It has not fought a battle. It has closed the door. March 4th to 6th, 2026. The shipping giants blink. The private sector moves faster than any government. Within days of the mines and the drone attacks, the world's major shipping companies begin making the calculation that their insurers and risk managers have been running for years, and the conclusion is the same every time. The strait is too dangerous. NYK Line, one of Japan's largest maritime carriers, announces a suspension of all Hormuz transits. MLL follows within hours. Then Frontline, Norway's tanker giant. Then Euronav. Then a cascade of smaller operators who cannot afford to lose a vessel and cannot get insurance at any reasonable rate. Over 3,000 ships, many of them already inside the Persian Gulf, find themselves in an impossible position. They cannot go forward. They cannot stay where they are indefinitely. And so they do the only thing left. They anchor and they wait. Ships anchored or stalled in the Gulf. 200 plus. Oil price, pre-war, $65 per barrel. Oil price, March 6, 2026, $108 per barrel. Daily oil flow through Strait, normal 20 million barrels. Daily flow after closure, reduced by over 80%. Here is where the story becomes something more than a military confrontation. Here is where it becomes a masterclass in the architecture of power. Iran does not close the strait equally. It turns it into a selective gate, a passage that is open to some and closed others, based entirely on geopolitical alignment. Chinese flag vessels receive quiet clearance to transit. Ships bound for India are waved through. A Turkish tanker anchored and waiting gets the nod. And the message embedded in every one of these selected permissions is impossible to misread. This blockade is not about oil. It is about who your friends are. The Western-aligned economies, the United States, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, find their tankers anchored and going nowhere. The BRICS-adjacent world keeps moving. Iran is not simply weaponizing a choke point. It is redrawing the map of geopolitical alliance in real time, using oil as the ink. And then there is the shadow fleet. For years, Iran had been building, quietly, patiently, and largely beneath the radar of Western intelligence, a parallel maritime infrastructure, sanctioned tankers operating outside Western insurance systems, ships that change their names, their flags, their transponder signals, sailing in the gray zone between legality and sanction. The shadow fleet existed to move Iranian oil when the formal systems of global trade were closed to it. Now, with the straight mind and the legitimate shipping world paralyzed, the shadow fleet keeps moving. Iran's own oil, sold to China, to India, to whoever is willing to buy outside Western channels, continues to flow. The rest of the world's oil does not. The asymmetry is staggering. Iran has constructed a system in which it is immune to the very disruption it is causing. It is a geostrategic equivalent of a player who has flipped the table and brought their own table to the game. The international response arrives quickly and reveals, in its urgency, exactly how unprepared the world was for this scenario. The International Energy Agency makes an announcement without precedent. 32 member nations will collectively release 400 million barrels from emergency reserves. It is the largest coordinated reserve release in the IEA's history, and it is, at its core, a gesture of panic dressed in the language of management. At normal pre-closure consumption rates, 400 million barrels represents roughly 20 days of global supply. The strait had been closed for less than 2 weeks and showed no sign of reopening. The maps were visible to anyone who cared to look. The emergency reserves were a bridge, and the bridge had a known end. Saudi Arabia announced it would divert as much oil as possible through the east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port Yanbu. The UAE activated the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline running to Fujairah. Together, these diversions could move perhaps 4 or 5 million barrels a day. The strait, on a normal day, moved 20. The United States Navy began slow, careful minesweeping operations in the outer approaches to the strait. But with mines, drones, and shore-based missiles all active simultaneously, progress was measured in miles per week, not per day. The events of March 2026 felt, to those living through them, like something entirely new, a crisis without precedent, a moment with no map. That feeling was understandable. It was also historically illiterate. The Strait of Hormuz had not created a new kind of power. It revealed a very old one. And to understand why the world was so unprepared for what Iran did, you have to follow the logic of Chokepoint geography back through the centuries, to the places where the story had been told before in different languages and different geographies, with the same ending. In the 3rd century BC, the Qin state occupied the Wei River Valley in northwestern China, not the wealthiest territory, not the most populous, and by no means the most militarily obvious candidate for empire. What it had was geography. The Qin controlled the mountain passes between the Wave Valley and the rest of China, choke points through which any army invading from the east had to pass, and through which any trade moving westward had to flow. Those passes were defensible. They were irreplaceable, and they gave the Qin something that sheer size and wealth could not buy: the ability to choose who passed and on what terms. When the Qin finally moved to unify China under the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, in 221 BC, they did not win simply by force of arms. They won because they had spent generations controlling the gates, accumulating strength, dictating the flow of commerce, and emerging from their geographic fortress ready to move. Geography had been their silent ally throughout. Iran, in 2026, had studied this lesson or arrived at it independently. The Strait was its mountain pass. The Persian Gulf was its Wei River Valley, and it had spent years preparing for the moment when closing the gate would be more devastating than any weapon in its arsenal. The Persian Emperor Xerxes arrived at the shores of Greece in 480 BC, commanding a fleet that ancient sources numbered in the hundreds of ships, a force so overwhelming that the Greek city-states briefly considered abandoning resistance entirely. The Athenian general Themistocles understood something that Xerxes did not. In open water, numbers are everything, but in a narrow strait, numbers become a liability. The Persian fleet, crammed into the channel between the island of Salamis and the Attic coast, could not maneuver. Its sheer size became its enemy. The ships collided with each other. They could not bring their full force to bear. And the Greeks, smaller, faster, fighting in waters they knew, destroyed them. Themistocles had not built a bigger fleet. He had chosen a smaller battlefield. He had made the geography fight for him. The power dynamic at Salamis was flipped not by superior strength, but by superior positioning. The Persians had the numbers. The Greeks had the gate, and the gate won. When you lay 1973 and 2026 side by side, the structural similarities are striking. A conflict involving Israel, Western support that angers the Arab or Islamic world, oil used as a retaliatory weapon, global markets in panic, emergency reserves being released, governments scrambling for alternatives. But the differences are what make 2026 so much more dangerous, and what reveal how much the power dynamic has shifted in the intervening half-century. In 1973, the choke point was political. OPEC decided to withhold oil, but the physical sea lanes remained open. Ships could still sail. The problem was will, not geography, and what can be changed by diplomacy, by pressure, by the passage of time. The 1973 embargo ended because the political conditions that produced it shifted. There was a negotiation. There was a resolution. The gate, which had never been physically closed, was opened again. In 2026, Iran has done something qualitatively different. It has not threatened to cut supply. It has physically closed the passage. There are mines in the water. There are drone boats in the lanes. There are missiles on the shore. The gate is not politically shut. It is physically shut. And opening a physically shut gate in a mine strait with active threats on multiple sides is not a matter of diplomacy. It is a matter of minesweepers, military risk, and time, measured in weeks, not in phone calls. And unlike 1973, there is no bypass. The Red Sea, already threatened by Houthi attacks, is no safe alternative. The overland pipelines of Saudi Arabia and the UAE can move 4 or 5 million barrels a day between them. The Strait, on a normal day, moves 20. The world is facing a shortfall that no combination of emergency reserves, alternative routes, and diplomatic pressure can quickly bridge. Markets are, at their most fundamental, a collective measurement of human fear and human confidence. They do not always get things right, but they are rarely wrong about the direction of crisis. And in the weeks after the Strait closed, they told a story that was clear, consistent, and frightening. Oil moved first and fastest. From $65 a barrel before the war, it climbed through 80, through 90, through 100, and peaked in the first weeks of March at $126. That single number represented something larger than a commodity price. It represented a global economy being asked to run on a fuel supply that had just lost a fifth of its daily throughput, with no clarity on when it would return. Gold moved with it, past $3,000 an ounce, then higher. Gold's movement tells a different story than oil's. Oil measures what the world needs. Gold measures what the world fears when both move sharply upward together. They are telling you that investors have concluded not only that the present is painful, but that the future is uncertain in ways that cannot be hedged conventionally. They are reaching for the oldest store of value in human history because the modern ones feel suddenly fragile. Oil pre-war, $65/barrel. Oil peaked early March 2026, $126/barrel. Gold pre-war, $2, 800/Oz. Gold, March 2026 peaked, greater than $3,000/Oz. IA emergency reserves released. For 100 million barrels, almost equals 20 days of normal straight flow. Beyond oil and gold, the ripple effects reach into every corner of the global economy. Not immediately, but with a slow, inevitable momentum of a wave that has already been generated and cannot be stopped. 1/3 of global fertilizer trade passes through the strait. By mid-March, the price of fertilizer used to grow corn and soybeans in the American Midwest had climbed from $475 to $680 per metric ton. Spring planting was weeks away. Farmers who had already committed to seed contracts were now facing input costs that threatened the viability of the entire growing season. The grocery store shelves had not yet felt it, but the supply chain logic was already written. The price rise was coming. It was simply in transit. 30% of Europe's jet fuel originates from or transits through the Persian Gulf. 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas, mostly from Qatar, flows through the strait. Aluminium smelters, battery factories, pharmaceutical plants, construction companies, all of them downstream the supply chain that ran through 21 miles of mined, militarized water. For the ships trapped in the Gulf or committed to journeys that could no longer transit the strait, the alternative was bleak arithmetic. Head south, past the coast of Oman, down through the Arabian Sea and past the Horn of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans collide in some of the roughest seas on Earth, and then northward, up the length of Africa's western coast, toward European ports. A journey that should have taken 2 weeks now took 6, 7, or 8. Fuel costs multiplied, charter rates for the ships willing to make the journey, and there were fewer of those every day. Exploded. Maritime insurance, for those who could get it all, had become an extraordinary expense, and even the Cape route was not clean. The Red Sea, on the northern end of that detour, was already a zone of Houthi drone attacks. Omani ports that might have served as staging or refueling points had been struck. The entire region had become a maze. Not a single blockade, but a network of interlocking dangers that made every alternative route a gamble rather than a solution. The power dynamic in global shipping, which for decades had run on the assumption that the strait was open and the Cape was a backup, had been completely inverted. The backup was now the primary route, and it was not built for the volume the world was suddenly sending through it. The Roman Empire, at the height of its power, controlled every significant choke point in the Mediterranean world. The Bosphorus, the Strait of Gibraltar, the Nile Delta, the Alpine passes. Through these gates flowed the grain that fed Rome's cities, the silver that paid its legions, the silk and spice that gave its aristocracy its luxuries, and the soldiers that held its frontiers. The empire did not fall in a single decisive defeat. It contracted, slowly, over generations. It lost control of its choke points, the Rhine crossings, the Danube fords, the mountain passes of Gaul and Hispania. As each gate fell outside control, the arteries of the empire shortened, trade routes collapsed, tax revenues fell, legions went unpaid, cities contracted, and the complex interdependent machine of Roman civilization, which required constant flow to function, began to seize. This is the pattern that repeats. The Qin controlled the mountain passes and built the first Chinese empire. Themistocles controlled the Strait of Salamis and saved Western civilization from Persian conquest. OPEC controlled the oil spigot in 1973 and brought the most powerful economies on Earth to their knees, temporarily, but memorably. And in 2026, Iran looked at 21 miles of water in the Persian Gulf and understood, with a precision that its adversaries had failed to match, that the gate was a battlefield. The United States had the most powerful military on Earth. Israel had the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the region. Neither fact changed the fundamental geography. Neither fact made the strait wider or gave the world an alternative route. And neither fact could quickly undo what Iran had done, because minesweeping contested strait under active fire is a slow, dangerous, methodical process, not a shock and awe operation. Power, in the end, is always more complicated than it appears on a military balance sheet. It lives in geography. It lives in choke points. It lives in the unglamorous, crucial infrastructure through which the lifeblood of civilization flows. And the central question that the Strait of Hormuz crisis of 2026 poses is not a military one, or even a diplomatic one. It is a civilizational one. How did a world that studied the lessons of Salamis and the 1973 embargo, that had war-gamed every scenario and stress-tested every assumption, arrive at a point where 21 miles of water could bring it to its knees? The answer, uncomfortable as it is this: because the world had decided, decade by decade, that the gate would always be open, that the oil would always flow, that the tankers would always arrive. And in the space between that assumption and the reality of Mine Strait, a shadow fleet, and 3,000 ships going nowhere, in that gap, the power had quietly, irreversibly shifted. Empires fall not because they are defeated. They fall because their arteries are cut. The Strait of Hormuz will reopen. Minesweepers will clear the lanes. Diplomacy will find its footing. The tankers will move again, and the price of oil will begin, eventually, its slow descent towards something tolerable. The crisis, like all crises, will pass. But the knowledge that was revealed in those weeks of March 2026, the knowledge that a 21-mile passage of water is the hinge on which the global economy turns, and that it can be closed by a nation with the will and the preparation to close it, that knowledge does not pass. It accumulates. It waits. And it asks, every time a tanker passes the strait in the years ahead, the same quiet, insistent question: who controls the gate?